So I'm more than honored to have our two presenters from this morning join me on stage now in what I hope will be an interactive panel discussion. I truly want the audience to participate, so feel free to just raise your hands if you have a question at any time, and someone will come over with a mic, and we want to hear what you guys have to say. Of course, you have Slido, but don't be shy. You know, make sure that we're still humans, right? We can still talk to each other, but we'll certainly incorporate whatever comments and questions you have on Slido during our talk. Our two guests don't need any introduction. I want to kick off by asking them a quick question. Do you think that we are actually in control of our personal data? Maybe start with Glenn.
I think we have the potential to be in control of our data. We certainly aren't fully now, but it's a really interesting situation because I analogize it in a lot of ways to the arms race that shaped the Cold War, in that you had two sides racing against one another to see who could stay ahead technologically and maintain technological superiority. And in a lot of ways, that's happening, although it's not now between nation states, but between, on the one hand, government agencies that want to engage in surveillance, or bad actors of the kind that Graham talked about, trying to invade people's data in order to steal from them or otherwise exploit it for nefarious ends. And then on the other side, you have people devoted to developing tools and instruments to safeguard data. And each time there's an advancement on one side, there's an advancement on the other. And right now we're kind of at a standstill where each time a new technology is developed designed to protect privacy, there's a new means developed to invade it. So I think that we're certainly not in some grim situation where we just throw up our hands helplessly and say, data is just there for the taking. We have no tools to protect it. We do have tools to protect it. None of them is invulnerable. None of them is perfect. But I think that they're rapidly improving thanks to both a commercial imperative, but also people who believe in the value of protecting it.
Graham, are we in control of our personal data? And if not, who is?
Well, no, we're not in control. Even if you're particularly privacy and security savvy, you are still making decisions and judgments all the time as to which third-party organizations you're going to entrust your personal information with. It's very hard, I would say impossible probably, not to interact with organizations who are interested in collecting your data. And I simply wouldn't be able to get through my life without sometimes having to make that decision as to whether I feel comfortable with Google or whoever it might be knowing something about me. And there certainly are decisions we can all make regarding which products we use and which services we use. I mean, I've just mentioned Google. I don't use the Google search engine, and I haven't used Google search engine for years. But that's because I found an alternative which was just as good, but I believe to be more privacy aware and more caring and not driven by advertising. And so I've made that decision. But there are other organizations who I have to entrust my personal details to. I can't escape from it because I want to run a business, and I haven't found a way of doing it without them. That's, even before you get into the whole sort of legal side of things and government side of things, where it's very hard to operate without sharing some of your personal information with them. So it's always a balancing act, but as Glenn says, there are tools out there which can reduce some of the risks, and they're sensible practices. I was speaking to a chap during the break who said that he hasn't run an antivirus program for the last 10 years. He said, I've never had a virus in 10 years. And I said, how would you know? But he seemed like he knew what he was talking about. He seemed fairly confident about it, so maybe he hasn't. Maybe he's just been terribly sensible about these things and not gone to too many dodgy sites. So there are steps we can take. And I think there's more education which we can do to raise awareness. But I don't have an enormous amount of confidence that the typical person is investing as much effort into protecting the information which they could be protecting about themselves as companies are investing in getting it out of us. So we are very much playing amateur hour, generally, as society, I feel.
You gave us quite an eye-opening presentation around how criminals go about obtaining information about us. But what about companies and governments? How do companies and government organizations go about obtaining personal information about us? And more importantly, what do they do with it? Glenn.
Well, it is interesting because the methods that Graham was describing for how common criminals use various methods for stealing data sounded very similar, in fact, essentially indistinguishable to me from the things that I was reading, for example, in all of the Snowden documents and in my work investigating official surveillance since then. Maybe they don't use bulldozers to go in and steal ATM machines, but they do pretty much everything short of that. There are all kinds of programs that, you were talking about using fake profiles that Western agencies use all the time to infiltrate political chat rooms, to trick you into giving up your password, into trying to encourage you to download devices that they tell you are security measures, but which are actually surveillance techniques. And so it's almost very difficult to distinguish, on the one hand, between legalized stealing, which is what security agencies and governments do, and illegal stealing, which is what hackers and criminals do. They're essentially using the same methods, and in fact, they often work together. A lot of times, people who begin as hackers who are in the business of just stealing your data in order to monetize it, like they want to take your money out of your wallet, end up working for the very agencies that we rely upon to guarantee our security or that we think are safeguarding and protecting democracy. And so these lines are often not just blurry, but almost non-existent. A lot of the techniques that are used that we have to worry about from criminals are the same ones that state agencies are using in the name of protecting us.
I think it's very important to understand that intelligence agents, for instance, just like criminals, don't have any qualms about hacking you. Even if you're not the target of their investigation, they will be happy to hack you or your company if they feel that your company may have information about someone who is of interest to them. So there is a famous case, for instance, of GCHQ in Cheltenham hacking into a Belgian telecoms company, Proximus, very big, also known as Belgicom. And the reason was that that telecoms company had some customers who were in the Middle East who were of interest to GCHQ. They didn't go and ask the Belgian telecoms company, can you give us this information about your customers? They hacked them. They used some of the same techniques, malware and so forth, as we were describing earlier on. And that's a friendly, currently both European nation, which another country has decided to hack. It's astonishing these things go on, but it does go on a great deal. So we all have to be aware that this is going on sometimes in our name.
Perhaps when it's not considered hacking, but just legitimate use of services, right? When we go on Facebook or we use Twitter or Google, how do they go about sort of harvesting that information? And specifically, are they, apart from advertising, is there something else that they do with our data?
So the interesting thing about these sort of sites is they use the most elementary technique in the world to get your information, which is they simply ask for it. And being humans, we're all very helpful, and we can't bear the thought of a form which hasn't been filled in properly. And so if they ask you for information, some of the information may be mandatory. You have to fill it in on the form in order to get it to work. Other things may be optional. And many people will fill in all those optional fields, which school I went to or whatever it is, and begin to pass on those sort of details. And I think there's a problem when people are using the internet is that they feel they have to tell the truth all the time. So when a website asks me a security question like, what's your mother's maiden name? I don't tell them my mother's maiden name because that's a matter of public record. Why on earth would that ever be used for security? So don't feel that you need to tell the truth. By the way, my mother's maiden name is Xena Warrior Princess, if any of you are interested. But don't feel that you need to answer these questions honestly, because they may never be verifying them. Your bank may never be checking these things. So unless it's something that they have to know, make something up instead. And that way, if they get hacked, or if some other agency comes along and says, we'd like that data, which you've lovingly scooped up for us, it won't necessarily be terribly useful for them. So that's one thing in terms of the data collection, but the ways in which it's actually used, other than advertising, is obviously things like profile. Well, I think you've probably spoken about this much more than myself, but all kinds of things such as profiling of people, gathering the data, so different clumps of data can begin to be. I don't have to tell you guys, you're all sort of data scientists and experts and these sort of things anyway, about the power of big data and how it can be used to people's advantage to exploit it more.
Yeah, it's interesting. For a long time, there was this distinction in how people talked about surveillance between private sector surveillance on the one hand, meaning Facebook, Google, and then smaller companies, and state surveillance on the other, not just Western surveillance agencies, but China, Iran, North Korea, and the like. And that distinction was intuitively appealing, which is that private companies have a motive in how they use data, which is they want to monetize it. So they don't really care who you are. They just want to sell your information so advertisers can target you, for example. And then a secondary distinction that's really important is that governments have a lot of power that private corporations don't have. So, for example, governments can put you in prison, they can take away your property. In a lot of cases, they can declare you unworthy of life, whereas corporations don't have that power. Governments like to use this information for repressive purposes. Private corporations like to use it simply to generate profit. There were all these kinds of distinctions that used to be drawn between why government surveillance was more menacing than private sector surveillance. Another example is that, for example, Facebook has only the information that you use through Facebook, so they don't have your Google chats or your Yahoo searches, or as Graham was saying, if you want to circumvent Google, you just use another company to search, and then you deprive Google of that information, whereas governments centralize all information by collecting it from everybody, and therefore it's more centralized and more menacing. But this distinction has increasingly broken down as the public and private sector have kind of merged, at least when it comes to the collection of data. And I think one of the things that alarmed me the most, to this day gives me the chills when I think about it, was a story that we did maybe 3 years into the Snowden reporting, so it didn't get as much attention as I think it deserved, it was a story about how the US government, when it would determine who its drone targets would be, didn't collect human intelligence principally. They did it algorithmically. So they would have programs that would try and analyze which people in Afghanistan or Pakistan were speaking most frequently to other people who they believed were terrorists or who were connected to terrorist organizations, and then assign them points based on how often they spoke or the kinds of communications they had. And as it turns out, one of the documents kind of listed, it was almost like sports standings, who was in first, second, third, fourth place, based on how many points they had. And the person who was in first place, algorithmically, was the Pakistan news chief, head of the Pakistan News Bureau for Al Jazeera. Because as a journalist, as you can imagine, he was speaking all the time to Taliban and to Al-Qaeda operatives because that was his job. Now, he ended up not being targeted by drones because they knew who he was, but you can imagine, as big data starts to be exploited for these kinds of purposes, how much we can start to dehumanize what ought to be very human considerations. And that's already the kind of thing that's starting. And a lot of those decisions are made now algorithmically by collecting data in conjunction with both the public and private sector working together.
Yeah, so our crowd perhaps is one of a unique group of people that actually understand how to algorithmically use data. And specifically in our industry, we've developed this new term called alternative data, which is practically everything that isn't market data or fundamentals. And we're obtaining data from all sorts of sources, from geolocation data, foot traffic, credit card information, anything related to satellite imagery, or anything that gives us an edge, if you may, in terms of what's happening to a specific company or to a specific sector in order to position ourselves better in the market. And in the majority of the cases, I think most firms don't really know exactly how this data is being sourced. And specifically, when we talk about data coming from individuals, from human activity, do you think people really understand what sort of profiling is taking place by companies on their data? Do you see any real awareness, or are we really living in oblivion?
I don't think most people are aware at all. I mean, some of the most eye-opening conversations I've had with people have been with people who maybe are on Facebook, for instance, or on Twitter, because that's a common ground which we can expect many people to use. And they sort of say, well, how much do they really know about me? How much could they possibly know? And what I normally say is, well, okay, this is just like dipping your toe in the water as to what is out there. But here's a service which you yourself use. Why don't you go and buy an ad on Facebook? Or why don't you go and promote a tweet on Twitter? And when you do that, of course, suddenly you have those pages available to you which have immense granularity as to who you want to target, what their income is, their gender, where they are in the world, whether they're into cats or sausage dogs or whatever it is. It's absolutely astonishing, the amount of information which these sites have collected about you. And that's before all of the other things which are going on. That's just purely to target an ad. So if people are astonished by that, and how can they possibly know this much about this audience, which means they also know this about me, I don't think they are aware at all as to what is going on. Which is, of course, part of the problem here is this complete lack of awareness about what is being done with their personal information and how it can potentially be abused.
Yeah, I think part of it is what I was suggesting earlier, which is that privacy is somewhat of an abstract consideration, right? You don't need anyone to explain why it's important that when we leave here, you go and have lunch and eat food. Your body makes it very clear to you why that's critically important. Whereas privacy is something that's very just ethereal. It's something that exists out there but isn't quite visible or tangible, and therefore is more difficult to apprehend. I remember the very first story that we did in the Snowden reporting was a story about how the US government was collecting records of every American's communications with every other American, who they were calling, the duration of the call, the location of where they were when the call was made. And I remember at the time the US government's response was, oh, well, who cares about that? It's not like we're listening to the content of your telephone calls. We're not listening to what you're saying. We're just collecting this very kind of harmless, banal information about you. And I remember a lot of people thinking to themselves, yeah, that actually seems pretty reasonable. It kind of strikes the right balance. Like, as long as they're not listening to what I'm saying, they just know who I'm calling. They don't really know much about what it is that I'm doing. And, you just stop and think about it for a minute. I would give speeches and I would say, imagine if you call an abortion clinic, or a doctor who specializes in HIV, or a clinic that provides drug or alcohol addiction services, or a suicide hotline, or somebody who isn't your spouse late at night. Imagine the picture that can be put together of you just based upon not anything that you're saying, but simply with whom you're communicating and the activities in which you're engaged in. And on the way here, I thought about how many times my activities were registered just during a very common morning. So I stopped off and used the ATM machine because I didn't have any pounds. I used my credit card to make a small purchase. I left my hotel with my key, and then I went back into the room and used the electronic key. I don't know how many cameras are on every corner here in London, but I'm sure it's a huge number. So just in the very small amount of time that I did very banal things during the course of my day, an electronic profile of me was created that's incredibly invasive and comprehensive about what my life is, about who I am and what I'm doing. And even as someone who works in the field, it takes a lot of conscious energy to think about why that's so invasive and why that matters.
We'll perhaps think of you more as a journalist, given your most recent work, but you're also a lawyer.
A recovered lawyer, is how I like to think about it.
From your professional opinion, do you think most of these sort of personal data collection practices are legal, or should they be legal in the future?
Well, one of the interesting parts of, for example, the controversies surrounding the Snowden reporting was, while people were shocked by the extent of the spying that was being done, because nobody knew about it, no one ended up going to jail for it. And there's a really good reason for that, which is that none of it was illegal. So there were these legal frameworks in place that kind of granted all of these surveillance agencies, these authorities, to engage in widespread spying with the expectation that they would only do it in targeted ways, but because there were no legal parameters to it, they were able to do it in ways that, while kind of were shocking to our sense of citizenship and to our expectations of what we were supposed to understand in democracy, there was nothing illegal about it. And since then, if you think about it, I think there was an expectation that there were going to be all these legal reforms, and instead, there's been a series of terrorist attacks that have been quite shocking. There's been the rise of ISIS. More recently, in the West, there's been the threat of Russia, currently Iran. So every time there's a threat that is either concocted, manufactured, exaggerated, or real, it feeds the framework that says that we ought to be more permissive about the kind of spying that we allow, not just public sector agencies, but also private companies which work with it, to engage in. So I think that Facebook has finally gone far enough that they are provoking the sort of legal backlash in a lot of different countries that for a long time people thought was impossible. But there's still a question about whether companies like Facebook and Google are more powerful than the governments now seeking to regulate them. And I think by every metric they probably are. So I'm not convinced at all that as much anger as there is towards these companies, as much kind of controversy that has been provoked, that it will lead to meaningful legal reforms, because I'm not sure governments have that capability any longer to control these companies.
I'm going to open up for the audience, so we'll load up our Slido questions. But if you have a question, please raise your hand. Okay, we got one right up here.
What do you think will be the next big Snowden?
What do I think is?
The next big...
Well, this is, one of the really, the thing that fascinates me about this whole concept of big data is that I was doing a little interview before this panel began about whether or not I think big data is the new currency. And what I said was, I think big data is not just the new currency, but probably the most significant way that we now organize all forms of our institutions. It certainly has revolutionized journalism. It has revolutionized all kinds of security. When I grew up, my hero was Daniel Ellsberg, who leaked the Pentagon Papers showing that the US government was systematically lying to the population about the Vietnam War. And I remember one time he told me this hilarious story about how his biggest challenge in leaking the Pentagon Papers was, how do you take 50,000 top secret documents and copy them in order to give them to the New York Times? You literally have to go to the drugstore with a huge bag of nickels and in the Xerox machine and photocopy one after the next in the hope that nobody detects you. And now, when Edward Snowden or Chelsea Manning or whoever delivered the DNC and Podesta emails to WikiLeaks want to do that, it takes about a half an hour to download onto tiny little thumb drives massive amounts of information. And that was really WikiLeaks' big pioneering recognition, was that not just journalism, but government and democracy and revolutions was going to be driven by leaks of big data. So obviously there have been big leaks of big data after Snowden. There was a huge leak of all of Sony's internal emails. The 2016 election in the US was driven by a massive digital leak. So I think that the more companies rely on storing their critical information with big data, which is inevitable that they're going to do, the more vulnerable they're going to make themselves to the Edward Snowdens and Chelsea Mannings of the world, who think that that information shouldn't be secret.
But do you feel like it's almost like the general population don't care? It's a headline for a few days, and then Kim Kardashian will have another kid, or Moby claims that he once dated Natalie Portman, or it's like there's so much trivia and rubbish out there that these things just disappear from the headlines. It's like, oh yeah, that Snowden thing happened. That's how I feel sometimes when I speak to people. The outrage is there for a day, maybe 2 days, and it will storm across Twitter, but then it begins to dissipate again. And that worries me, because there are some very important issues being raised here, but trivia seems to be driving the world instead.
Yeah. I mean, definitely when I was in Hong Kong with Snowden, I remember him saying to me, my biggest worry isn't that I'm going to end up in prison for the rest of my life, because I expect that to happen. My biggest worry is that I'm going to end up in prison for revelations that people will care about for about a week and then move on. But I think that in a lot of ways, although it's imperceptible, these things start building up over time. And, I think you do see that Facebook, for example, the problems that they have over the abuses they're perceived to have committed with their data are very serious and enduring ones. They're perceived as threatening democracy. They're perceived as threatening our ability to discern true information. Same with Google and its ability to... So I think you're right, of course, that entertainment and trivialities and fluff command our attention for lots of different reasons. But I do think that these controversies are building up in a way that they're going to start to become enduring and inescapable for the companies that are responsible for them.
I'm going to ask Susan to load up our Slido questions on the screens, but while she does that, I'd like to ask you both, and I'll start with Graham. Some people do argue that digital privacy does not exist, right? Yeah. We are in this perhaps dilemma as to whether it does or not, and yet, like Glenn pointed out, we probably haven't made up our minds, but it is an important part. Do you think that privacy is dead?
Well, I've got a counter-argument, which I think maybe Facebook is dead, or will be soon. I can't imagine that they're still going to exist in 20, 30 years. Maybe they'll get into a completely different line of business, but maybe that will happen instead. I certainly would welcome that. Probably because most of their users will have popped their clogs, and youngsters will be on some other ghastly site sharing pictures of their privates on instead. But is privacy dead? No, I generally like to feel upbeat about it. Although I was making those points just now about triviality sometimes consuming people, I think there are more people, and the tools which can help you remain private are getting much easier to use. In the early days of PGP and encrypted email, it was torturous, and many people made dumb mistakes, myself included, setting up some of those programs. Now you can just put an app on your phone, and you can communicate much, much more securely and keep those thoughts. I think the challenge is more getting more people to recognize that this concept of privacy is something actually which is important. I sometimes wonder if the challenge for us here in Britain is that, see, it was interesting what you were saying about the British maybe not caring so much as the Germans, and I think that it probably is true. I wonder if the challenge which we're facing is that we haven't had a serious crisis since the 1940s, and the threat that there may be people in charge, if we don't do something about it, who could change our way of life, and we've become rather complacent about those things. And maybe every now and then society needs a bit of a wake-up call and reminded of what can be lost if we don't stick up for important concepts like privacy. But we do need to find a way to really get people to care about this, because it is a slippery slope. We're making baby steps right now, but it's a slippery slope, and the normalization of us sharing our information and not being private is a worrying trend.
I'm going to turn to a question on Slido, and I find it fascinating that people actually go about buying devices that listen to everything they say, services like Alexa, right? Should we be worried about these types of assistant services, if you may, living in our homes, listening to everything that we say? And can we trust these organizations with this information, even when they tell us that they're not listening?
Yeah, so we recently did some investigative reporting. It wasn't me, it was colleagues of mine at The Intercept about this product that Amazon has been successfully marketing called Ring, which is a home security system that sets up a perimeter of cameras around your home so that if anybody breaks into your home, there's going to be a recording of it, so it's just basic security. But what it also does is lets you monitor in real time, so you're at work and you want to see if anybody's entering your house, who it is who's entering your house. It's a really effective means of security because nobody can approach your house without being detected. At the same time, if you think about it, that data is incredibly invasive. Who visits you at night? Who visits you during the day? How many people come to your house? Who are they? And it turns out that Amazon has been incredibly reckless with how this data is protected. So a lot of people who are paying money to think that they're securing themselves and their physical safety, and in some sense they are at the same time paying money to a company that is simultaneously violating their security. I think there were Ukrainian and Korean programmers, for example, who had mass access, uncontrolled access to the data that was being collected, completely unbeknownst to the user. So all of these services are very dangerous, even when they kind of have two sides to them, a positive and a negative one. And the problem is that unlike government agencies, which at least have some pretext of transparency, we have laws that allow us to find out what government agencies are doing. These private companies operate almost entirely in the dark. We have no way of knowing, for example, the progress that Google and Facebook are making with artificial intelligence, probably the most consequential technology being developed, if not implemented. We know almost nothing about them. And with this Amazon breach, we knew about it only because somebody within Amazon approached one of our reporters and documented it all to them. Otherwise, Amazon users wouldn't have known. So there's always these dangers kind of endemic to these technologies.
Graham, do you think the newer generations, are they going to care more about privacy than previous ones, or will it be something of the past?
I don't know, I'm just a middle-aged fat guy, you know. I mean, I don't know what youngsters feel about these things. I feel so disconnected from them already as they're on Twitch playing their video games and all this other nonsense. It's hard to say. I think it varies. I think some youngsters are very privacy conscious, partly because, you know, they care about these things and they've read the news reports and they're aware of what big companies are doing with their data, and there are others who simply don't give a damn. What worries me is the norm, is the general slide, as I'm saying, the sort of, and you begin to feel like a bit of a weirdo if you're the one who keeps on arguing for privacy or to protect my private information. You know, we just had a question about Google Homes and Alexa. I haven't got one of those in my house. I would never have one of those in my house. Not just for the privacy reason, but also for well, what would I do with it? Why do I need one of those? Is it just that I've got money lying around and it'll be a cool gadget because I'm into technology? But the norm, when so many households do have them, or so many people are comfortable with creating a Facebook account, for instance, you begin to feel like the outsider. And it's weird how society does that. But I do feel and worry that we are on that slope. So I'd like to think youngsters are caring more about it. I think I'm probably the wrong person to ask. I'm trying to be optimistic about it.
You know, just one thing about it, I mean, because I the new father of two kids, my husband and I adopted two children about 2 years ago. And so all of these bizarre things about kids, which I actually understand less now that I have kids than
Join the club.
I did before. But I think about things like, you know, there's controversies where people who end up in the public eye at a young age, 20, 22, athletes, celebrities, they always end up having discovered some, you know, terrible thing that they ended up writing to their Facebook friends when nobody knew them, or some terrible tweets that are bigoted or inflammatory in some way, because that's what teenagers do, is to be transgressive, say the things that you're not supposed to say. And that's one of the things that I really worry about as well, is I honestly, I think the thing for which I'm most grateful as somebody who has a public profile and is in politics and is in a place where people will use anything against you. The thing for which I'm most grateful is that there was no internet to record my thoughts when I was 20 years old. And I worry about what that will do, that all of our thoughts are going to be recorded, that all of our spontaneous ideas are going to be forever preserved and linked to our identity and linked to our name. And I think as we see more and more people harmed by that, hopefully an awareness of why privacy matters will begin to grow, even among younger people who might be inculcated with the idea that they're not supposed to care about that.
The world is changing so fast. It's only 12 years since the iPhone came along. It's massively changed the world as a consequence. Everybody's got an iPhone, or they've got a phone which is pretending to be an iPhone, basically, which is copying the same design, which means everybody has got a camera with them. Everyone's got a video camera. Everybody's got an internet connection. Everyone can film something and shove it up on social media should they wish to. Everyone is contactable pretty much all of the time, and their location can be found. It's, what an astonishing thing to have happened in such a... It's no wonder, when I'm dealing with my in-laws who are elderly, it's no wonder that they are completely baffled by technology and how fast things have changed, because I would be similarly confused to suddenly see the world turned upside down in that fashion. So those are the sort of challenges which we're facing. The world is changing, and so our attitudes to things like privacy and our personal data are being challenged as well.
When you think about going back to our space, we're in the business of identifying interesting data sets and providers that capture information that helps us, again, get an edge in finance. But one of the untapped sources, I think, is still very much people. That is, if you think about it, there are more than 5 billion individuals with mobile phones. And as you pointed out, just walking a mile will reveal so much about you through your mobile phone, right? Do you think people have the right to, A, claim that data or claim ownership of that information that is being generated by these devices, whether it's the mobile phone or the home assistant? And do you think we should have the right to monetize it or share in the profits that the Googles and the Facebooks are making today from our data? Glenn.
Yeah, so I think that, even as somebody who obviously falls on the pretty far end of the privacy spectrum, versus privacy versus, say, exploitation of data, if you want to define the poles that way, I recognize that there are genuine benefits to having data collected and exploited and used. I live in Brazil, and I have a media outlet that I co-founded that is a Portuguese language media outlet, and I do a lot of reporting in Brazil and do a lot of TV in Portuguese and a lot of writing. And the ability of Google Translate to, in almost a perfect way now, translate English into Portuguese and Portuguese into English, which they developed only because so many people voluntarily gave their data to Google that enabled Google to understand how the human brain functions and therefore translate language almost perfectly. It's not quite perfect, but it's getting better every day. Is an incredibly valuable service. The fact that I was born with no sense of direction and yet was able to arrive here was due only to the fact that Google Directions knew where I was and helped me get here. And even though I knew I was telling Google where I was coming from and where I was going, it was worth it for me not to arrive 2 hours late and be lost somewhere in the middle of London. So I think these trade-offs are important to recognize even as we evangelize about the importance of privacy. What we need are not, some kind of Luddite ban on big data or an attempt to abolish it, because aside from the fact that it's never going to happen, it's probably not good for humanity anyway. But I think what we need are very strong reforms that have to be international in scope, with very strong regulatory efforts. And as I said, the animosity and contempt that is building for Facebook is something that I hope accelerates, both because it's morally deserved, but also because I think it has a great advantage, which is that it really is becoming the driving force behind what a lot of people like Graham and I have been hoping for a lot of years would happen, which is that people would wake up and realize what the dangers of big data really are if they're allowed to go unregulated and unprotected.
I was interested that you asked, do companies have the right to have this. And I don't think they do have the right. I think they have the right to ask for it. I think they have a right to give the user an opportunity to show some informed consent and say, okay, I'm comfortable with that. And so if they understand what the implications are, what they get out of it, and how the other company, not hidden away in a 97-page terms of use article or something like that, then I think that's fine. But I don't think there's a right. I think you have to ask permission. It's just polite, anyway.
But even when you think about informed consent, I mean, I'm sure many of us, if not all of us, have just clicked through the terms and conditions of a service that we need immediately, right? If I download an app and I need to check prices on wines or a specific thing, I'm just willing to accept it, and I probably don't read a single word in those agreements. And perhaps GDPR and other new regulations coming up may change that. It's early to tell, but we're not, at least psychologically, not changing our habits. Do you agree with that, and do you think we need to rely on other parties to determine what the rules of the game should be?
Well, I think you're right. I mean, we are getting upgrades to our laws. I think GDPR is a step in the right direction, and the right to be forgotten is an important one. So if we do make decisions we later regret, our data can be wiped and not be used. Of course, people don't read all of the terms and conditions. None of us do. Actually, I know one guy who does, but he's very, very odd. But other than him, people obviously don't do that. But it's about informed consent. So just getting that sort of summary of what is going on, which is perhaps most important with these things. I would like to... I've forgotten what I was going to say now. What did you just say again?
We don't have a lot of time.
No, we don't have a lot of time. Anyway, I'm just getting to that age, really, where I can't remember things. But, so I think there are things which are improving. I think the laws are getting better and people are getting smart about this. I think it's kind of hard to enforce upon organizations, though, because ultimately, even if they have the best of intentions, they may be insecure. They may be leaking data. So even if they don't intend to exploit your information or sell it to third parties for who knows what purpose, it may still end up in the hands of others.
So we only have 2 minutes left. I would like to ask you to leave us with your thoughts on the future. Where do you see sort of big data going? What should we be thinking about over the next 10 years?
Well, so personally, I mean, when I think about it, I think about it with a fair degree of optimism, because I think that, as often happens when there's an unregulated environment, abuses will start to become so egregious that the level of human outrage will become sufficient that it even breaks through things like obsessions with trivialities. And I think that when you see things like people blaming the election of Donald Trump or the success of Brexit on Facebook and its failures to manage its data responsibly, or the threats posed by Chinese and Iranian hackers on our ability to maintain security, you're starting to see that kind of tipping point reached where genuine reform will become possible. And at the same time, there really are now tools available, widely available tools, that aren't that difficult to install any longer, that are almost being operated by default, that will protect people's privacy in a meaningful way. But I don't think we're ever going to reach a point where it's one or the other, where we have a perfect world of privacy, or we have a perfect world of unregulated data exploitation. It's going to be this constant back and forth, trying to find a balance. But I think that we are starting to see, much more so than, say, 5 years ago, an awareness, a growing awareness, not just among ordinary people or privacy fanatics, but society at large, that we can't allow big data to just explode in an unregulated way, because the damages that will be done are far too severe.
Yeah, I'm not a fortune teller. It's hard to predict the future. I think Glenn is right. We're going to see more people becoming privacy conscious, but at the same time, there's going to be more people who are also very keen to make more of big data, which is not necessarily a bad thing. There's plenty of good ways in which obviously it can be used, as well as the bad stuff. So I think it's very hard to say where we are going other than we ain't seen nothing yet. I think this is just the beginning. It's going to be a completely different world in 10, 15 years because of things like big data.
Graham, Glenn, thank you so much for joining our event. Please give a round of applause to our panelists.
This is RavenPack.